AP Biology, Chapter 42, Part 5. Blood clotting. When you cut yourself, your blood stops coming out of your body after a little while, and now we're going to explain why that happens. If you take a look here, if you cut yourself, you have these like sharp or these edges where the wound occurred. And on this area where the wound happened, we have these little platelets kind of forming a plug. Now, platelets are parts of other cells, and the circled parts are the important things that you need to write down. Think of it as like a dam. If you can imagine like a rock in the middle of a stream, occasionally twigs and branches will collect on that rock. You can kind of think of the platelets as those branches and twigs. Once one twig or branch catches on that rock, another one catches on a twig, another twig catches on another twig, they eventually form a blockage in the stream that eventually becomes a dam. You can kind of think of the platelets as kind of working the same way. They're sticky, and when they hit the edge of the wound, they kind of stick to the edge and eventually form a plug, just like a little dam. And that keeps you from bleeding to death. The other thing that's involved with forming a blood clot is fibrin. And why don't you go and write that down? Fibrin is a protein that will reinforce this plug to stop the loss of more blood. So the two things involved with blood clotting: platelet plug and fibrin. Now you can imagine that someone who is a hemophiliac, someone who has that recessive genetic disorder, remember that was a sex-linked genetic disorder, doesn't have the ability to make one of these clotting factors. So depending on which one they can't make, thrombin, fibrinogen, fibrin, they're not going to be able to form a plug effectively, and if they can't form that plug, they can bleed out, and that's kind of a dangerous situation. All right, cardiovascular disease. Cardio means heart. Vascular means tubes. So we're talking about the heart and the tubes, arteries and veins. Leading cause of death in the United States. Up there also is cancer and strokes. Plaques develop on the inner walls. Plaques are just buildups of deposits from things like lipids. Stroke, heart attack, arteriosclerosis, hypertension. It does have a genetic risk factor involved. However, smoking, lack of exercise, and diets rich in fat are also risk factors with cardiovascular disease. Cardiovascular disease is something called a rich country disease. In a poorer country, you die from things like amoebic dysentery and malaria and other things that are more treatable and controllable in first world countries. First world countries tend to have a lot more food supply, especially fatty foods, so they tend to have more obesity and cardiovascular disease. And we in America definitely have this as a problem. All right, here's the number of deaths caused by different things in 2001. Heart disease at the top, then cancer, and then stroke. Remember, stroke is a blockage to the arteries feeding the brain. So if you can't feed the brain oxygen and glucose, the brain cells die, and you can't live without a brain. Chronic lower respiratory diseases, especially old folks, they sometimes get lung infections that they don't recover from. Accidents. Accidents are the leading cause of death for young people, and you should be aware of that. Diabetes, if you can't feed those cells sugar constantly, then the cells start to die in untreated diabetes, and that sometimes results in loss of arm and legs before death. Influenza, the flu, especially in old folks, they die of pneumonia, lung infections. Alzheimer's, basically mental deterioration. You start to forget even your family members. Nephritis, the prefix neph means kidney. So nephritis means an inflammation of the kidneys. So we're talking any kind of kidney disease or filter of your blood that is not occurring. Septicemia is a blood infection, and if the infection spreads to your bloodstream, it can spread to the rest of your body fairly quickly. You don't have to have these memorized. This is just a background. You should know that the three leading causes of death in the United States are heart disease, cancer, and stroke, though. All right, stroke fact sheet. You can see here that we have more strokes in the southern United States. As you might guess, people spend more time indoors in the southern United States. It's a lot hotter down there, especially with the advent of air conditioning in the 1950s. People started to move south. And as a result of fatty foods and an indoor lifestyle, there is a higher incidence of cardiovascular disease and stroke in the south. Colorado is one of the more healthy states in the country. A lot of people like to do outdoor activities, and we have beautiful weather to enjoy a lot of outdoor sports. All right, we're done with the circulatory system, and we're moving on to gas exchange, the respiratory system. Remember that circulatory system connects all these systems together, including the respiratory system. We're going to be getting oxygen from the lungs to the blood to the cells of your body for cell respiration. And then we have to get rid of the carbon dioxide from cell respiration at the lungs again. So that's kind of the purpose of respiration, getting oxygen into and out of the cells. All right, gas exchange, remember it's oxygen, carbon dioxide. We need to provide oxygen for aerobic cell respiration, making that 34 ATP by the electron transport chain. And this is important. You need to have a moist membrane in order for oxygen to dissolve into something or to move into something. If the lung spaces inside ever dry out, or the fish gills ever dry out, or whatever is absorbing the oxygen ever dries out, the oxygen can't be moved from the air into the bloodstream. So you have to have a moist environment or a moist membrane for oxygen to be dissolved into. Also, high surface area. Remember, we need a lot of oxygen to do a lot of cell respiration, and we'll talk about some of the adaptations for increasing surface area coming up. So why high surface area? Maximizing rate of gas exchange, and carbon dioxide and oxygen will move quickly by diffusion if there's a lot of surface area. More surface area, more diffusion. Why moist membranes? Moisture maintains the cell membrane structure, especially gases diffuse only dissolved in water. So make sure you write that down there, and make sure you understand that high surface area is a big deal in all living things, and especially in the respiratory system. Remember, we increase surface area in the digestive system using villi, which are the little finger-like projections in your small intestine to absorb more nutrients into your bloodstream. All right, gas exchange in many forms. If you're single-celled, you just go from high to low concentration across the cell membrane. Amphibians breathe through their skin. They also have some smaller lungs, like in frogs. The amphibian skin has to be wet in order for the oxygen to dissolve into it. If that frog skin or newt skin ever dries out, they're not going to be able to breathe through their skin anymore, and that's a dangerous situation for the frog. Don't have to worry about the echinoderms. They have these little papilla that they exchange gases through. It's little bumps on their body. You should know that insects breathe through these holes called spiracles. Spiracles are little holes in the sides of insects that they exchange gases. They don't breathe through their mouth. This is called a tracheal system, basically a bunch of tubes within the body to allow gas exchange and diffusion from the external environment, the air, to the cells of the body. Fish have gills. The gills have lots of blood vessels where gases can be exchanged with the water. Remember, oxygen can dissolve in water, but not as well as it doesn't have as much concentration as air, oxygen. And here we have the mammals. And in mammals, we have something called an alveoli. Look at all that surface area for exchange of gases. We've got a lot of these like little grape-like clusters in our lungs for exchanging gases. This is an internal surface, so it's always moist, so we can do gas exchange. That's an adaptation for being a land animal. Take a moment to review these methods of gas exchange for different organisms. All right, you should also know that if you're an aquatic organism, you don't have to really worry about drying out because you live in the water. So we have these surface areas that are exposed to the external environment. Fish gills would be a great example. Fish gills are right there next to the water. If you take a fish out of water, the gills dry out. Dry gills can't dissolve any oxygen, and the fish dies. So if you catch a fish and you want to keep it alive, you just have to keep on spraying the gills with water in order for it to continue to breathe. If you're a land animal, also called terrestrial, you have internal respiratory surfaces as an adaptation. And these surfaces for gas exchange don't dry out. That allows you to live on land. Remember that fish only have a two-chambered heart. They have one atrium, one ventricle, and they only have a single loop system. That one ventricle has to pump blood, blue representing oxygen poor, to not only just the gills, but to the body cells as well. If you remember in mammals, we have a two-loop system. We have one ventricle, the right side, just going to our lungs, and then we have the left ventricle just going to our body cells. Big disadvantage of having gills is that they can dry out. All right, now we got some more information here. This is how gills work in the water. Basically, the water goes in through the mouth of the fish and then passes over the gills. And while the water is passing over the gills, oxygen is exchanged with the blood vessels. Now we're going to have to write this down. It's called counter current exchange system. Counter means opposite. Current is the direction of water flow. So we have blood in the gills of the fish flowing in the opposite direction as the water. And we're going to see why this has adaptive value in a second. If you take a look here, we have the water, and the water has different concentrations of oxygen. Here we've got 100%, 70%. The reason why it's going down is we have diffusion, high to low concentration, from higher oxygen in the water to lower to the capillaries of the gills inside the fish. So 100% to 90%, we have diffusion, 70-60, diffusion, 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 oxygen getting into the bloodstream of the fish. Fish can do cell respiration and continue swimming. Now, let's explain how counter-current exchange works and why that's a benefit. So here we have counter-current exchange, and this is how fish gills actually work. At the bottom here, we have concurrent exchange, which is not how fish gills work, and we'll use this as an example of why this is a disadvantage. Remember to rewind at any point if you need another explanation. All right, so counter-current exchange, we have the blood flowing in this direction from right to left, and over here we have the water flowing in the opposite direction, or counter to the blood flow. Now, as the blood is flowing in this direction, it starts off with fairly low amounts of oxygen. It's coming from the cells of the body, and then it's going to increase in oxygen concentration. Even at the first point of where the water enters or touches the gills, we have diffusion occurring from high to low, high to low, high to low, high to low. As long as there's a difference in concentration, we can have diffusion occur, and that's good for the fish. Now, if you look at the bottom here, we have concurrent, and why this wasn't selected for. If we had water moving the same direction as the blood, 100% to 5%, 70 to 30, once the blood and the water reach equilibrium, or the same amount of oxygen in the water and the blood, there's no more diffusion. And if no more diffusion occurs, there's not going to be any more gas exchange, and you can't pull out any more oxygen from that water. So as you can see with concurrent exchange, what happens eventually about halfway through is you can't pull any more oxygen out of the water because you reach equilibrium, and the fish can't pull extra oxygen. When you have countercurrent exchange, the blood flows in opposite direction of the water, and you can have diffusion of oxygen into the blood at every step of the way. All right, so let's take a moment and explain the benefit of countercurrent exchange over concurrent exchange in fish. And let's make sure we write this down. Now, there's some gas exchange advantages on land versus the water, and there is a disadvantage as well. And you should know both of these. You can jot out some notes on this. The air, living on air, has some advantages. It has higher concentration of oxygen. That's the first thing you have to know. The second thing you have to know is that oxygen and carbon dioxide move much faster through air than in water. And it's much easier and lighter to pump air than it is water, so you expend less energy exchanging gases on land. So 1, 2, 3 reasons why land gas exchange is better than water. But there is one big disadvantage, and you have to keep your respiratory surfaces moist to prevent drying out. And if they ever stop being moist, you won't be able to exchange gases anymore. Fortunately, it's on the inside of your body where it's always moist, your lungs, so that's not a big issue. Land animals don't use gills because gills are exposed to the external environment and will dry out too quickly. All right, we talked about this before, and you might want to take some quick notes on this. Insects have trachea, which are a tracheal system of tubes for exchanging gases. And if you can look, it's like all throughout the body here. Remember those little holes in their side are called spiracles. They don't have lungs. They have a system of tracheal tubes. And it doesn't even enter their circulatory system. It just is found throughout their entire body. All right, lungs are our gas exchange system. There is a risk, however, getting bacteria inside in a moist environment where they can reproduce, cause things like pneumonia. Over here we have the alveoli. You should write this down. The alveoli, that's coming up in a second, will be the functional unit of the lungs. So what is the most important part of the lungs? It wouldn't be the tubes, it wouldn't be the trachea, it would be the alveoli. Now you can see these little grape-like clusters have lots of blood vessels, and that's true of the villi of the small intestine as well. We're going to be exchanging the gases with the circulatory system in the lungs, and we're going to be absorbing nutrients through the villi of the small intestine to the circulatory system. So that's why there's a lot of blood vessels next to your lungs, and that's why it's very red. All right, let's write this down. Alveoli, gas exchange across the thin epithelium, very thin surface. And we have almost 100, or there is 100 square meters of surface area to absorb oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. All right, so you should be able to trace the path of air from your mouth to the lungs to the cells of your body. Remember that the common, first of all, the air itself is filtered by hairs. The hairs in your nose actually act as a filtering system, and it's humidified, warmed up a little bit, allows it to diffuse faster. Then the food air tube is called the pharynx. The food moves and the air moves through the same tube for this. There's a branching point that leads to the glottis. Remember, food is stopped from going down the glottis by the epiglottis. After the air goes to the glottis, so the hole that leads to the trachea, it's going to go through the larynx, the vocal cords. Then the trachea is the major tube, the windpipe, branches off into two bronchi that branch off further into bronchioles. They're just tubes, and eventually to the functional unit of gas exchange called the alveoli. We have mucus inside of our lungs and cilia. The cilia beat upward to push bacteria back into your mouth to be swallowed, and the mucus traps dust, pollen, and particulates. All right, we do need to write this down. This is called negative pressure breathing, and basically we pull in air, we don't push in air. And we're going to talk about an animal, frogs, that push in air, but we don't do that. So take a look here. We have our lungs. When the diaphragm here underneath the lungs goes down, that's going to increase the volume inside your chest. When you do that, you create low pressure. You have more space between the air molecules. As a result of creating a partial vacuum inside your chest, when your diaphragm goes down, the air gets sucked in. That's a pull. And a pull is negative pressure. When your diaphragm relaxes, it pushes up, and the air just kind of gets pushed out. But to get air in, you increase the volume of your thoracic cavity, the top part of your body, by contracting your diaphragm. The diaphragm has to contract when it goes down, and that sucks in air. Sucking in air, negative pressure. Make sure you write that down. Why does it happen? Diaphragm contracts. Now, there are some animals with positive pressure breathing, frogs, and that's not as efficient. They have little tiny lungs, not as it's not as functional as our lungs. Frogs have something called a buccal cavity. They fill up this buccal cavity with air, and then they push the air into their lungs, unlike how we do it. So they have positive pressure breathing. So write that down. Positive pressure breathing. Frogs push the air into the lungs from the mouth, this buccal cavity. All right, let's write this down. How do you control breathing? The medulla, located right here at the brainstem, sets the rhythm, or how fast you breathe, and the pons will either speed that up or slow that down. Make sure you write down the medulla. The medulla on the brainstem controls or sets the rhythm. Now, you also have in your aorta and carotid arteries in your neck oxygen and carbon dioxide sensors to tell if carbon dioxide or oxygen is going up or down in your blood. But this means that you don't have to think to breathe, as long as you have a good medulla. All right, let's write this down. Medulla monitors the CO2 levels. That's important. CO2, not oxygen, is being measured in the blood. Now, remember, CO2 mixed with water will produce something called carbonic acid. That's the reason why soda pop has carbonic acid in it. It's the CO2 mixing with water. Now, as you get more CO2 from exercise, you're going to make more carbonic acid, and that's going to drop your pH. When the pH drops, remember, acid is lower than 7, your medulla recognizes that and tells your lungs to start breathing faster to get rid of the extra carbon dioxide. Make sure you understand that. Step 1, you exercise a lot, rising carbon dioxide levels. Step 2, carbonic acid builds up in your blood. Step 3, medulla monitors that lowering pH and tells your lungs to breathe faster to get rid of it. And that's why you breathe fast when you exercise. Your medulla is telling you to. Diffusion in gases, we have just gas exchange from high to low concentration. Oxygen is higher in concentration in the lungs, lower in the blood, so high to low. In the blood, the carbon dioxide is higher, so it goes from high to low and leaves your blood. Now, this is a little bit different from your muscles. Your muscles have lower oxygen, so the blood oxygen is higher, goes from high to low. your carbon dioxide levels are higher in your muscles, so that leaves your muscle cells and goes into your blood. And that's how we move carbon dioxide and oxygen. All right, there's some things you should know about hemoglobin, and we talked about hemoglobin a little bit earlier. There are 250,000 or 250,000 hemoglobin in each one of your red blood cells. So what's the role of this protein? Well, first of all, you should know that there's 4 subunits to hemoglobin, and in the center we have an iron atom, and this is just one heme group on the hemoglobin protein. It's not the entire thing. Without iron, you can't fold your hemoglobin properly. Now remember that hemoglobin binds oxygen, and each one of the 4 subunits is going to be able to bind one oxygen molecule. Now we have a term for this. It's called cooperativity. Once the first oxygen molecule binds, it changes the shape of the protein slightly, which allows the other 3 subunits to pick up oxygen more easily, and that is called cooperativity, and we're using hemoglobin as an example. Here we have releasing oxygen happens the same way. Once the first oxygen releases from one of the subunits, the other 3 quickly follow as the shape changes back to a form that's more able to pick up new oxygen. All right, here we have a review of what happens between the cells of your body as well as the lungs. In the tissue cells, we have carbon dioxide being higher in concentration in the cells. Remember, that's where you're doing cell respiration, diffuses from high to low to your blood. And then your carbon dioxide, some of it dissolves in the plasma of your blood and just gets transported via the liquid part of your blood. However, some of the carbon dioxide combines with the hemoglobin and is transported within the red blood cells. And the most important is bicarbonate ion, and you should write this down. Bicarbonate ion, or HCO3, you don't have to have that part memorized, is the main way that we transport carbon dioxide within our blood. Bicarbonate ion. We just change that bicarbonate ion back to carbon dioxide once we reach the lungs, and then the carbon dioxide diffuses from high to low concentration to the lungs and then is breathed out. So 3 ways we transport carbon dioxide: dissolved in the water of the blood, bound to the hemoglobin protein directly, and converted to bicarbonate ion. And we'll put a little star here. That's the main way. We also have carbonic acid that will transport carbon dioxide as well. And if you remember, the carbonic acid triggers the medulla to tell your lungs to breathe faster if that becomes too high. All right, just a couple more terms here, just to talk about lungs a little bit. Tidal volume is the volume of air inhaled or exhaled with each normal breath. Vital capacity is the maximum amount of air your lungs can hold. And then residual volume, even if you breathe out all the air of your lungs, try to take an exhale all the air out, there's still a little bit of air left in that lung, and that's called residual volume. All right, this ends Chapter 42 notes on Part 5.